A black boy in a server's apron approached the table with steady hands, though years of being looked down on taught him to expect anything but kindness. Malik Johnson had done this 100 times, but tonight it felt heavier. The man, Chase Whitmore, didn't look up. He didn't need to. Men like him had spent generations being looked up to. Malik's apron was clean, his posture respectful, his voice steady when he said, "Evening, sir." Still, Chase wrinkled his nose like Malik had brought poverty with the ribs. "You call this service?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Laughter followed, forced, cutting, familiar. Malik stood still, his knuckles white around the tray, not because he was weak, but because he knew how strength sometimes means staying silent. Around him, forks paused mid-air. Mama Bernie wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. What happened next wouldn't just change the evening. It would change everything. It would change everything. Collins Tavern didn't serve food. It served as a memory, the kind that lingered in the grease-stained wallpaper and the chipped linoleum floors, the kind that creaked with every step like an older man refusing to be forgotten. On humid nights, the tavern glowed like a relic. Neon beer signs buzzed at the windows, and ceiling fans stirred the thick scent of smoked ribs, sweet tea, and stories no one dared write down. Laughter came easily here, but silence came quicker, especially when the wrong kind of man walked through the correct type of door. That night, Malik Johnson wasn't walking in. He was already inside, already part of the rhythm. A 19-year-old black boy in a faded apron, tray in hand, moving from table to table like a ghost people tolerated, but didn't see. He had grown up 3 streets over and lived most of his young life learning how to smile in spaces that weren't built for him. He didn't resent the work. He respected it. But respect didn't pay for college, and dreams cost more than tips. Collins Tavern was his bridge, the place between the world he came from and the one he hoped to reach. Then came the man in the linen suit. Chase Whitmore entered like someone who thought the building should adjust to his presence. Tall, silver-haired, and smug, he walked past the Help Wanted sign and sat without a word, his sunglasses still on inside. Malik saw him and knew instantly. The kind who asked for respect before offering any in return. The kind who assumed the tray you carried said everything about your place in the world. Malik approached with quiet precision. The plate was hot, garnished, and flawless. He set it down gently, the way he'd been trained, one hand under, one stabilizing the edge, body angled slightly away to avoid intrusion. Chase didn't look up. He wrinkled his nose, his lip curled. "You call this service?" he said, loud enough for a table nearby to flinch. The words weren't shocking. Not here. Not now. They were predictable, almost scripted. The same lines spoken in different diners, in other decades, by men who thought their discomfort mattered more than someone else's dignity. Malik stood still. He didn't look down. He didn't speak. He didn't retreat. Because he knew that in some places, especially places like this, being a black boy and being silent meant survival. Somewhere in the back, Mama Bernie saw everything. She always did. But she waited. Not to see what Chase would say next, but to see if the room would allow it. The walls didn't speak. The regulars didn't move. The plate stayed on the table. The heat from it rose like a question no one wanted to answer. This was Collins Tavern, a southern place, a quiet place, a place where history didn't shout anymore. It whispered through every interaction, every gaze, every moment. A black boy had to decide whether dignity was worth the risk. And on this night, something was about to shift. Malik Johnson was just 19. but his bones already knew the weight of waiting and waiting for change, for recognition, for that small moment when the world might finally see him as something more than a body in a uniform. Every morning before his shift at Collins Tavern, Malik walked the same 3 blocks from his grandmother's house. He passed by cracked sidewalks, peeling paint, and the church that once gave out free lunches when his mama had nothing to pack for school. His stride was steady. His eyes were forward. But the truth was, he was always balancing something. Plates, expectations, history. He wore them all like invisible armor. He worked with quiet precision, carried trays like they were glass sculptures, smiled without giving too much, thanked customers even when they didn't look at him. He learned to absorb discomfort as if it were part of the job description. But beneath the quiet, Malik was building something, a dream stitched together from late-night textbooks, scholarship essays, and whispered prayers. He wanted college, not just for the degree, but for the escape it offered. Not from his people, but from the boxes the world kept trying to fit them into. His dream school was Howard University. It felt far, almost fictional, but he had earned straight A's, applied for grants, and he had Mama Bernie in his corner, a woman who told him every time he clocked out, "Don't stay stuck in places that don't see your light." Still, even dreams had their costs. Malik worked 2 jobs. On weekends, he stocked shelves at the Piggly Wiggly. At night, he studied under the yellow bulb in his grandmother's kitchen, tracing algebra problems with a pencil so short he had to grip it sideways. Sometimes he wanted to scream. Not because he was angry, but because he was tired of having to be twice as good, just to be seen as enough. One night, a customer left a $20 bill on the table with a note that read, "You're too smart for this place." Malik stared at the paper, unsure whether to feel flattered or insulted, as if his worth could only exist somewhere else, as if his presence here was a waste instead of a necessity. But he stayed. Not because he had to, but because he knew that dignity wasn't tied to a title or a school's name. It was tied to how he moved, how he treated people, and how he refused to let bitterness claim him. To some, Malik was just another boy bringing food. But if they looked closely, they'd see the storm he carried in his silence, the fire that hadn't gone out, despite everything. They'd see a young man holding his head high, not because the world lifted him, but because he refused to bow. And that night at Collins Tavern, when Chase Whitmore smirked and spoke like he owned the floor, Malik didn't flinch. Because this wasn't just a job, it was his training ground. Chase Whitmore didn't look up when Malik approached. He rarely looked up for anyone, especially not someone who reminded him of the country he pretended didn't exist anymore. The table was polished, the bourbon was neat, and the plate was hot. Malik set it down carefully, nodding slightly. Chase sniffed, a slight curl of the lip, a pause. "You call this medium rare?" he asked, voice loud enough for the following table to stop mid-conversation. "It looks more like a burnt offering. What do they teach you people back there? Microwave etiquette?" The last word hung in the air like a slap. The room quieted. Malik straightened. He had heard worse, but it never stopped stinging, not because it was new, but because it was never supposed to be still happening. "I can ask the kitchen to remake it, sir," he said evenly. Chase laughed, not kindly. "Oh no, don't trouble yourself. I'm sure you're better at carrying plates than understanding orders. Can't expect much more, can we?" Laughter cracked around the booth. His friends, 3 other men in golf shirts and gold watches, chuckled without looking at Malik. They sipped bourbon and glanced around like the tavern was theirs. Malik didn't move. His fingers flexed at his side. His throat tightened, but his eyes never left Chase's. Across the diner, an elderly couple exchanged looks. A young woman dropped her fork, but no one spoke. This was the South. This was routine. And Malik, like so many before him, had learned to absorb pain quietly, to fold it down into a corner of the soul and carry on. Behind the counter, Mama Bernie saw it unfold. She didn't step forward yet. She studied the room, gauging the weight of silence, the discomfort, the familiar ache of watching history repeat itself in the same four walls. Chase leaned back, pleased with himself. He was a man accustomed to being heard, feared, and untouchable. And Malik? He was the help. That's how men like Chase thought the world still worked. You know, Chase added, swirling his drink, places like this used to know their place. Now it's all sensitivity and second chances. Maybe we ought to remember who built this country. Malik's jaw tensed. He could have walked away. He could have snapped. He could have done what 1,000 others might have done, and he almost did. But then he remembered his grandmother's words. Never let someone take you out of your peace. That's how they win. So he said nothing. And that silence, calm, complete, unbending, was louder than anything he could have screamed. Mama Bernie finally moved. Slow, deliberate, with the weight of generations behind her. The heels of her shoes struck the floor like punctuation. She walked through the thick air of discomfort until she stood at the edge of Chase's table. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her hands didn't shake. And with a voice smooth as molasses but sharp as a blade, she said, "Mr. Whitmore, we don't serve hate here." The air in Collins' tavern was no longer heavy with heat. It was dense with something colder. Silence. The kind that draped over tables, slid down the walls, and wrapped around the throats of every diner who had heard Chase Whitmore's words and chosen to stay quiet. But Mama Bernie moved. Slow at first, deliberate. She folded the towel she had been using to dry dishes and placed it on the counter, as if it mattered more than pride. She stepped out from behind the bar, each footfall echoing with a kind of finality, like the closing of a history book that refused to stay shut. She approached Chase's table and didn't ask for permission. She didn't have to. She had owned this place long before men like Chase started building condos over old neighborhoods. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm, but edged like a whetted blade. "I've been serving in this town longer than you've been sipping bourbon, and in all that time, we've had all kinds walk through that door." Chase blinked. His friends went still. The tavern held its breath. "But let me make one thing real clear," she continued. "We don't serve hate here. Not in my house." Chase opened his mouth. Whether to protest, apologize, or deflect, no one would know because Mama Bernie cut through him, not with anger, but with memory. "You see that boy you just tried to shame?" She gestured toward Malik, who stood motionless behind her, eyes locked on the floor. "He works 2 jobs. He studies till sunrise. He still sends part of his check home to his grandmother. And every time you speak down to him, you don't just show who you are. You show what kind of world you think should still exist." Her words struck softly but intensely. There was no shouting, no finger-pointing, just truth, wrapped in the kind of authority only time and pain can grant. She turned to the room now, speaking not just to Chase, but to everyone. Kindness isn't weakness. Respect isn't earned by status. And dignity isn't something you get to give or take away. It's something we're all born with. The weight of her words sat in the silence like a stone in still water. Even Chase's bourbon looked embarrassed. She turned back to Chase once more, slower this time. Her voice dropped just enough for the room to lean in. "Let me ask you something, sir. If someone served you with grace, despite how you treated them, what does that say about them? And more importantly, what does it say about you? The question didn't just belong to Chase anymore. It belonged to every person in that tavern. It belongs to everyone watching this moment. So, tell me this. When you see someone treating another person like they're less, would you speak up or stay silent? Malik Johnson left Collins' Tavern that night with more than just his apron folded under his arm. He carried a fire, quiet but unshakable, that lit the path ahead even when no one else could see it. In the years that followed, he worked harder than most people his age could imagine. He took early shifts unloading trucks and spent late nights surrounded by textbooks in a one-bedroom apartment he shared with his cousin. Sometimes he went to sleep hungry. Other nights he went to sleep proud. Both made him stronger. He was accepted to Howard University on a partial scholarship and made up the difference by tutoring high school students and working as a dishwasher on campus. While others slept, Malik studied. When they partied, he planned. He didn't just want success, he needed it, like breath, like proof that all the pain his family had swallowed wasn't for nothing. But even as he rose, graduating with honors, earning a place at Columbia Business School, landing an internship that turned into a job, he never forgot the boy with the tray. He never forgot Chase Whitmore's smirk or the weight of a silence the room had been too afraid to break. And he never forgot Mama Bernie, who had shown him what power looked like when it came dressed as decency. At 29, Malik became the youngest regional director at a major logistics company. By 33, he'd launched his firm, one that focused on fair labor, local hiring, and second chances. He didn't just want to be successful. He wanted to be the kind of man who helped rewrite the rules. Then, one afternoon, scrolling through local listings, he saw something that stopped him cold. Collins' Tavern. For sale. The building was still standing, still red brick, weathered, still carrying stories between its floorboards. Mama Bernie had passed away a year before, and her niece was closing it down. Malik didn't hesitate. When he walked through those doors again, it smelled like home and history. He didn't change much, kept the old jazz photos on the wall, the ceiling fans, even the laminated menu. But he added something new, an employee program that taught customer service and life skills, as well as a framed quote above the kitchen window. It read, "Kindness is quiet courage." Now, years later, he stood before a group of new hires, young faces full of uncertainty, some wearing the same nervous smile he'd once worn. He told them his story, not the version with the degrees and titles, the real one, the one that began with a trembling tray and a man who thought dignity came with a price tag. He spoke of his mother, who cleaned houses where no one ever learned her name, of his father, who died too young and too tired, of himself, the boy who learned to listen louder than he spoke. He ended with this: "You will serve people who think they're better than you. You'll face words that sting, silence that bruises. But never let that define your worth. You're not just here to carry plates. You're here to carry yourself with grace, even when others don't." And as the room grew quiet, the same kind of quiet that once tried to shrink him, Malik smiled. Because this time, silence didn't mean fear. It meant they were listening. The diner was quiet now, long after the lunch crowd had come and gone. Outside, the sun was beginning to lower behind the tall oaks, casting soft gold across the cracked pavement. Inside, Malik Johnson stood by the counter of Collins' Tavern, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing the edges of a place that had once watched him shrink, and now watched him rise. He wasn't just the owner. He was the story the walls had been waiting to tell. Earlier that day, a young server named Jalen had been mocked by a customer for mispronouncing a wine label. Malik had watched it happen from the far booth, the same one where Chase Whitmore once sat. And for a moment, history threatened to loop again. But Malik didn't interrupt. Not immediately. He waited to see how the room would respond. This time, something was different. Another customer, an older woman at the table behind me, turned and said calmly, "That's not how we talk to people here." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. It was enough. The man went quiet. Jalen straightened his shoulders and kept serving, a little taller than before. Later, Malik called a staff meeting. No memos, no reprimands, just stories. He stood where Mama Bernie once stood and told them what she once told him, that a restaurant isn't just where people eat, it's where people remember who they are. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. There will always be people who believe their money buys them power, who thinks your skin, your accent, or your name tells them your value. But here, we do things differently. Here, we serve food with pride. We serve kindness with backbone. And we don't let anyone walk out thinking they're more human than the person who served them. He looked at them, servers, cooks, dishwashers, hosts, and knew they weren't just employees. They were carrying something larger than paychecks. They were holding the line between dignity and dismissal. He told them again about his parents, about growing up cleaning church floors, about getting mistaken for security at his own company's ribbon cutting, about the rage he once felt and the resolve that replaced it. "I don't want you to fight every battle," he said. "I want you to know when to speak, how to hold the room, and why your silence sometimes says more than 1,000 words." He paused, then asked them the question that had lived in him for years. What kind of world are we building if we only defend the people who look like us, speak like us, live like us? What kind of legacy are we leaving if we let dignity be optional? That's what stayed in the air as the meeting ended. No applause, no dramatic music, just a room of people standing a little taller, a little more awake. That night, as Malik closed up, he walked to the back of the diner and turned off the lights. But before stepping outside, he glanced once more at the quote above the kitchen window. "Kindness is quiet courage." And for those watching, reading, remembering this moment now, maybe that's the question we all have to answer. When you're given the chance to stand up for someone who's been made to feel small, will you take it? What we witnessed in that diner wasn't just a story. It was a reflection of power, of silence, of courage wrapped in humility. Some of us are Malik, holding it all in and rising anyway. Some are Mama Bernie, choosing to speak when the room goes quiet. And some, like Chase, are faced with the truth of who we've been and the chance to change. But many of us are simply watching. The question is, what do we do with what we've seen? I invite you to share your thoughts. If you had been there, who would you have been? What choice would you have made? If this story made you feel something, anger, pride, hope, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment, because your voice might be the one that gives someone else the courage to stand up next time. Thank you for listening and for caring.